Hey, good morning, Calvary. I said good morning, Calvary. Yeah, there we go. Hey, my name is Will, and I have the privilege of serving as a pastor here at Calvary, and I love seeing so many college students here. I want to ask a couple of questions. Do we have any theater majors in the room? Any? I saw that was a hesitant hand. Be confident in your major. We got another one here. Any English majors? Okay. Let's go, okay. And any film majors? There we go, okay. All right. Well, you know, stories are amazing, no matter how you tell them, whether it's through theater, whether it's through literature, or whether it's on the screen. And one of those stories that is amazing in all three mediums is To Kill a Mockingbird. Anybody seen that one? Just an incredible book. I got to see, when we lived in New York, I got to see Jeff Daniels play Atticus Finch. Incredible moment. And then if you've seen the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, there's something about courtroom dramas, right? There's just something fun about them. Another one of my favorite courtroom dramas is the movie 12 Angry Men. Anybody over the age of 40 love that one? But, you know, both of them tell a similar story, and the story is an innocent man or a boy, and in both cases a racial minority, is unjustly accused of a crime they didn't commit. And the story unfolds as the lawyers and the jurors and the townspeople begin to, what they thought was a given because of their preconceived views of how the world worked, what they thought was a given, an open and shut case. The story begins to unfold, and they begin to see the truth, and it wasn't what they expected. And we find that the person is innocent, and it leads us to ask this question. It's like the jurors and the townspeople and the lawyers and the judges have to ask the question of, what are we going to do with this truth? Because it goes against our preconceived notions. It challenges our understanding of the world. It forces us to empathize with people we've never really considered empathizing with. And then at the end of each of these stories, a decision has to be made about what is good and true and just. And what I love about courtroom dramas and stories like this are that they're about specific characters. And they're about, Boo Radley and Atticus Finch and Scout and all these things. And yes, it's about specific characters. And yes, there's a specific plot line, yes. But these stories are actually about us, aren't they? Because what they do is at the end, when the curtain closes or when the credits fade to black, we are forced, as the viewer, we have to ask a question: what am I going to do now? Who am I? What do I believe about the world? What things that do I hold true that need to be reevaluated? What characters in this story must I emulate? And what am I going to do now? How am I going to live? You see, stories of these courtroom dramas force us to ask questions about how we view the world. And today, we're continuing our study in the Gospel of John, and we're in John chapter 18, in which we see the trial of Jesus. And like any good courtroom drama, this has it all. It's got intrigue, conspiracy, suspense, murder. It's got it all. But like any good courtroom drama, as we read this story, it's going to force us to ask questions not just about the players in the story, but about ourselves. What are we going to do with the truths that we see in this passage? Who are we going to be? What are we going to be? What are we going to do with the truth that is revealed to us about Jesus? And are we willing to ask the hard questions? So this passage, just to set the context a little bit, last week we saw where Jesus was arrested. We're skipping the part where Peter denies Jesus. We're going to touch that in a few weeks when we get to the end of John's gospel. And now Jesus has been brought before, he's arrested, he's been brought before Caiaphas and the chief priests. They question him, and Jesus says, hey, look, guys, everything that I've done in public. Okay, you're trying to find something to pin on me. You're trying to make me into a criminal. He says, everything I've done in public. All my miracles, all my teachings, all this stuff. I taught in the synagogue, in the temple. I did my miracles out in public. Listen, let my action and let my words speak for themselves. There's no hidden agenda here. I am who I am. And they look at Jesus and they strike him across the face. And this is where our text begins. This is John chapter 18, verse 28. It says, and then they, meaning the chief priests, led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. Well, it was early morning, and they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, and so that they could eat Passover. So Pilate had to go outside to meet them, and he said, So what accusation do you bring against this man Jesus? And they answered him, well, if this man were not doing evil, we would have not delivered him over to you. And Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. And the Jews said to him, well, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. In verse 32, John tells us, he says, all of this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. And so I want us to pause right here and just what's happening, what's going on. So you've got the chief priests, right? So the chief priests were the Jewish religious leaders. And then there's Caiaphas. He's sort of the top dog of these guys. And they want Jesus to be tried and executed. So from the moment Jesus came on the scene, the moment he started teaching in the temple and people started listening to what he had to say, the moment that he started healing people, and this moment that he started eating with tax collectors and sinners and raising Lazarus from the dead, these guys said, no way, this guy is causing too much of a commotion. He's coming in on our territory. He's getting our converts and he's taking them to him. We gotta put this man to death. And so they had decided, it was in their hearts that they were going to kill Jesus, no matter what. And so what they do is they bring him to Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman governor of Judea. And Pilate says, all right, guys, what did this man do? And they respond, this is insane. They said, if he weren't doing evil, we wouldn't have brought him to you. Okay, so let me just explain this to you. Pilate, they bring him in, and Pilate says, so what charge do you have against this man? They're like, we brought him to you. He's like, yeah, I know. What did he do? They're like, well, we wouldn't have brought him to you if he didn't do something really bad. And he's like, well, what did he do? And they're like, but listen, man, like we wouldn't have brought him if he hadn't done anything bad. It's just this cyclical non-answer that they're giving him. And Pilate sees through their game. He's like, why are you guys bothering me with this? Why are you guys bothering me with this guy? Just try him yourself. I don't want anything to do with this. And Pilate actually asks a very good question. He says, why are you bothering me with this? And the question is, why are they bothering Pilate with this? Well, you see, the Jewish leaders, the reason they bring Pilate into this, because they're in a bit of a pickle. They're in a conundrum themselves because they really want Jesus dead. But they have to be careful how he dies, okay? And so they have really two options. The first option is they can just kill him illegally. They could stone him to death. This is not beneath them. They've done it before. They're going to do it again with Stephen in the book of Acts. But Jesus, the problem with doing this with Jesus is way too popular with too many of the people, with too many of the Jewish people. And they realize that if they put Jesus to death without due process, then it's going to look really bad on them and the crowds could revolt. And they don't want that because they want to maintain their power. So they want to do something without losing their power. And so they don't want the crowds to revolt. So first option's off the table. The second option then is they can go through the proper channels and have him charged with a crime and tried and sentenced and killed by capital punishment. But there's one problem there, and that is that Rome had stripped the Jewish leaders from the right, it had stripped the right to enact capital punishment from the Jewish leaders. Only Rome could give the death sentence. So these Jewish leaders are like, well, we can't do it legally, and we can't go through the proper channels because we're not even allowed to do it anymore. And so they said, we got to have Pilate. This is why they bring Pilate into the mix. Because they know that Pilate could have him executed, but they also know, they think they're clever. They know that Rome's official form of capital punishment was crucifixion on a cross. And see, they knew their Bibles, they knew their Old Testament, and there's this passage in Deuteronomy 21:23 that says, anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. And so they're thinking, if we can get Pilate to execute him, he'll be executed on a cross, and then we can say, hey everybody, look at Deuteronomy 21:23. He's hanging on a cross, therefore he's under God's curse. No way he's the Messiah. Everybody move along, nothing to see here. See, their plan wasn't just to kill Jesus, but it was to mock, humiliate, and silence all of his disciples. And what's funny is they think they're being clever, right? But just like we learned last week, they were never in control. God is sovereign, and they were playing into God's sovereign plan. This is why John adds this little note. He says, all of this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show what kind of death he was going to die. Jesus had been talking about dying on a cross since the very beginning. And they're just playing into his plan. And so we hear that, and maybe you're asking, you're like, well, what's Pilate's deal? Like, what's his personality like? And we actually know quite a bit about Pilate from history, not just the Bible, but through extra biblical sources. And we know that Pilate was born outside of Rome. He worked his way up the chain in the Roman Empire, first as a soldier. So he had some battlefield successes and kind of started making his way up the ladder of power within the Roman Empire. But then he ultimately did the thing you got to do. Any good opportunist knows if you really want to get close to power, you marry the granddaughter of Emperor Augustus, right? So he married Emperor Augustus's granddaughter. That puts him in this place of power, and they make Pilate the governor of Judea. And the thing we know about Pilate from history is that Pilate loved the finer things in life. All right, anybody fans of The Office, the Finer Things Club? Pilate was all about it. He loved success, he enjoyed power, and he loved more than anything the wealth and the celebrity that came with power. And history tells us that Pilate was ruthless in his pursuits for power and wealth and prestige and acclaim and all the rest of it. But history also tells us that he was a terrible leader. He was not a good politician. He was not a good statesman. He was in over his head. And he's been the governor of Judea for quite a while now at this point, and he's just made one political mistake after another. And so at this point, he's extremely unpopular with the Jewish people. His approval ratings are in the floor. They're in the tank. And in order to maintain his position as the governor of Judea, he's in this really slippery predicament where Caesar has asked him to do two things: keep the Jews under control and maintain Rome's power in Jerusalem. And so he's in this sort of, and Caesar is like, if you can't do those two things, you're out of there. And so he's unpopular with the Jewish people, so he's got to keep he's got to keep them from revolting. He doesn't want them causing any kind of revolution or anything. So he doesn't want to upset the Jewish people, but at the same time, he has to flex his authority as an instrument of Rome. And so he's in this really kind of dance that he's in of trying to maintain his power. In verse 33, it says, "So Pilate entered his headquarters again, and he called Jesus and said to him, 'Jesus, are you the king of the Jews?' And Jesus answered, 'Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?' And Pilate answered, 'Am I a Jew? Your own nation and your chief priests have delivered you over to me. What is it that you've done?' Pilate's still trying to figure out what Jesus has done. And Jesus answered, he says, 'My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world.' And then Pilate said to him, 'So shoot me straight. Are you a king?' You see, Pilate, what he's trying to do here is he's trying to figure out if Jesus was a real threat to him. Or is Jesus a real threat to his power, or is he just some nuisance to the Jewish leaders? 'Are you a king?' he asked Jesus. 'Are you coming for Rome? Are you trying to start a revolt? Are you coming for my position? What's going on, Jesus?' And Jesus answered, he said, 'You say that I'm a king, but for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice.' And Pilate said to him, 'What is truth?' 'Am I a king?' Jesus says. He says, 'Yeah, sort of, but not in the way that you think of a king.' He tells Pilate, he says, 'My kingdom's not of this world. My purpose is not to accumulate power. I'm not coming for your seat. I have one purpose, and it's to bear witness to the truth.' And Pilate famously then responds, he goes, 'Well, what is that? What is truth?' And after he had said this, Pilate went back outside to the Jews, and he told them, 'I find no guilt in him.'" Like, he just can't find any guilt in him. But he devises a plan. He says, "But you guys have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now, Barabbas was a robber, John adds. Gospel of Mark adds that he was also an insurrectionist and a murderer. So Barabbas is a bad dude. So what happens is, after this lengthy conversation, Pilate is just grasping for anything that he can find to kill Jesus. And he can't find a single thing. Jesus says his kingdom is not of this world. He's not seeking political aspirations. He's not trying to overthrow Rome. He's no threat to Pilate. He's no threat to Caesar. Pilate's like, I can't find any fault in him. And Pilate's just thinking at this point, he's like, I just want to get out of this situation and go back to my palace and eat my fancy food and hang out with my fancy friends. That's all I want to do. And so he comes to the Jews. He says, look, guys, I'm trying here. I can't find anything wrong with him. But Pilate knows, he knows that that's not going to be enough for them. He knows that they're like sharks. I mean, they are hungry. They're thirsty for blood. And so Pilate said, he comes up with a plan that he thinks is going to be able to squirm his way out of the situation he's in. So his plan is he thinks this will end the conversation. His plan is he appeals to a Jewish custom where Rome would release one Jewish prisoner at Passover as a sign of goodwill. It's sort of a keep the peace sort of thing that they did. And so what Pilate does is he grabs the worst guy in the prison, Barabbas, insurrectionist, murderer, robber, brings him up to the Jewish leaders, and he says, all right, look, we can, tradition says I can set one Jewish prisoner free. Here's Barabbas. He's one of your guys. He's just awful. And then there's Jesus. He says, okay, so who do you want me to set free? And he's thinking, surely they're not gonna let Barabbas go free. And what do they say? To his amazement, they say, we want Barabbas. And then chapter 19, verse 1, it says, at that moment, Pilate then took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, Behold the man. And when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him! Crucify him! And Pilate said to him, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. See, Pilate, he knows what's right, and he wants no part in this. And the Jews answered him, they said, We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. And when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. So Pilate is terrified at this point. Big, powerful Pilate, he's shaking in his boots now. Because he's got this innocent man before him. He knows what the right thing to do is, but he's torn because he's in between this rock and a hard place. If he sets Jesus free, the Jews revolt and he loses his position. But if he crucifies Jesus, he's got blood on his hands. And if Pilate doesn't do what they want, he knows that it's over for him. And so he has to make a choice. Is he going to maintain control of his power and his wealth and his status? Or is he going to execute an innocent man? And it says, verse 9, it says, He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You'll not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have the authority to crucify you? And Jesus answered him, You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. It says right here, But from then on, Pilate sought to release Jesus, but the Jews cried out, If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic called Gabbatha. And now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, Behold your king. And they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? And listen to this. The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. God. And so he delivered Jesus over to them to be crucified. So what do we do with this passage? It's this well-known account of Jesus being unjustly tried and sentenced and executed. But you're like, what do we learn from this? What are we supposed to do with this other than just kind of marvel at the injustice of it all? I want you to consider like the end of a courtroom drama. Like the end, when you close the last page of To Kill a Mockingbird, you're forced with a question. What am I going to do now that I know the truth? What are you going to do knowing the truth about Jesus? And so I want to look at all the characters, all the players in this story. Are you going to be like Caiaphas and Pilate? Are you going to be like Barabbas? Who are you going to be like? So Caiaphas and Pilate, let me ask you this question when you consider their lives. Will you let your love for the things of this world distract you from the most important question? Are you going to every one of us are faced with a decision today. Will you let your love for the things of the world distract you from the most important question? And it's easy to look at this passage and judge Caiaphas and Pilate with contempt. How cowardly these guys were. But I want you to see that they're struggling with the same things that we all struggle with. See, both Caiaphas and Pilate, they knew what the truth was, but they were afraid. They were afraid that if they embraced the truth of who Jesus was, they would lose their grip on the things they loved the most. And with Caiaphas, we see he was a religious leader. And you would think he would be concerned with truth and righteousness and honoring God, but he was actually more concerned with the comforts that come with power. And I don't know about you, but there is nothing more pathetic. There is nothing more pathetic in this world than when a religious leader who is supposed to be the example of conviction and virtue and truth lays aside his or her convictions in order to gain proximity to power. There's nothing more pathetic than that, when religious leaders lay aside their convictions to cozy up to power. I think of German priests and pastors in Nazi Germany who went along with the regime of Adolf Hitler knowing that it was unjust because they wanted the perks of being in the inner circle of power. That was what Caiaphas was doing. He was the priest, but his greatest love wasn't the truth of God. His greatest love was that he was close to power, that he was in the inner circle. And he knew that Jesus was threatening to pull him out of that. And we know this. We know that Caiaphas doesn't really worship God. We know that Caiaphas is not really concerned with the things of God. And the reason we know this is because at the very end, Pilate says to Caiaphas, "Shall I crucify your king?" And Caiaphas, the chief priest of the people of Israel, the nation chosen by God to be a light to the nations, he said, "We have no king but Caesar." How pathetic. God was supposed to be their king. And yet he says, "We have no king but Caesar." And in that moment, Caiaphas was exposed. This is not a sincere religious man with religious convictions and a concern for the things of God. This is a man who used religion to gain what he really wanted, which was power and comfort. One commentator said, in this moment, Caiaphas, he's taking off his religious mask. And he's saying, "Look, governor, hey, Pilate, look, we all play games. My game is religion. But I know the truth. It's all about power. So I have no king but Caesar. I admit it. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put my religious mask back on. I'm going to put my chief priest costume back on. And I'm going to go back to pretending that God is king. But you and I both know the truth. My king is comfort and power." And when confronted with the truth of who Jesus was, Caiaphas turned away and he kept playing his silly religious games. And then there's Pilate. Sometimes I'm inclined to feel sorry for Pilate, aren't you? You read it and you're like, boy, he was put in a position, wasn't he? He couldn't find any guilt in Jesus. It was just like, he doesn't order Jesus to be killed. He doesn't want to order Jesus to be killed. He doesn't want the masses to riot. He doesn't want to lose his job. He's just like, it's just this messy situation. But if you look at Pilate more closely, you realize that it's actually the blood of Christ on his hands. And he killed Jesus by his passiveness and his indecision and his unwillingness to confess in the moment what he knew to be true about Jesus, because he was afraid of what it would cost him. He knew Jesus wasn't guilty. He knew Jesus was a good man, and a man of integrity would have never let an innocent man die. But Pilate's top priority never was truth. It was his own reputation, it was his own comfort, and it was all the finer things in life. And when he came face to face with confessing the truth of who Jesus was or taking the easy way out for his own comfort and reputation, he chose the latter. And let me just speak real pointed right now. I fear that this might be many of you in this room today. You're here, you're like, I'm at church. I'm not an atheist, right? I'm not rejecting Jesus. You're like, I'm not against Jesus. I'm here. I'm doing the thing, right? But when confronted with the commands of Jesus and the invitation of Jesus to lay down your life, pick up your cross and follow him, to make him Lord of your life and your decisions, to allow the truth of who he is to affect your life and to change the choices you make, you're like, I'm not ready to do that yet. And you still cling to your own preferences and pleasures and worldly pursuits. And when forced to choose between Jesus or your own self-interest, if you were really forced today, you would choose yourself. And in the end, you aren't really confessing Jesus as Lord, and you're not really following him. You're just sort of tolerating him. You're flirting with him. And there may be times in your life when you're confronted with Jesus, the truth of who Jesus is. You may be at a funeral and you're just hit with the weight and the brevity of life. Or maybe you're in a situation where you feel kind of the gravity of your life. Or maybe you have a moment of fragility. Or maybe you come to worship and you hear these songs and you're like, yes, Jesus is Lord. Or you see a baptism and you're like, yes, that is true. But like Pilate, you go, that's going to cost me too much. I might have to break off this relationship, or I might have to start living this way, or I might have to actually start obeying the way of Jesus. And so what you do is you go, yeah, I believe it to be true. I can't find any fault in Jesus, but it's just too much for me. And so you brush it off. And some of you college students, just being honest, I was there. I've been there before. I'm not saying this with judgment, but some of you think this is what's in your mind right now. I'm going to do the college thing. And I'll come back to Jesus later in life. And I'll get my things in order later in life. But I'm going to have fun while I'm here. Listen, that is not a decision. That is you putting off the most important question that you can ask. If Jesus is Lord, will you follow him today? If Jesus is Lord, is he worth your devotion today, not 10 years from now? If you think, listen, I'm telling you, if you think that one day you will be ready to make a commitment to him, once you've had all your fun, I want you to be careful, because your indecision today, your unwillingness to fall at the feet of Jesus today will slowly harden your heart and make your heart callous towards the things of God and toward the truth of who he is. Listen, we all know this to be true. Men, if you try this with women, it's going to end badly for you, isn't it? Indecision never leads to anything good, right? You spend time with the girl, you're texting them, you're flirting with them, but then when it comes time to commit to them, you're like, your indecision will eventually separate you from them. And you see, this was Pilate's problem. He did not make a decision, but his indecision actually put Jesus to death. His indecision was a decision to walk away. And I just want to plead with you guys here today. God may be speaking to you, and you're like, there's always tomorrow. There's not always tomorrow. And you're thinking, there's still so many other things I want to do and experience, and following Jesus might hinder that. Listen, indecision today might cost you everything. Indecision today is actually a decision to walk away, and I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to be like Caiaphas, clinging to worldly comforts. I don't want you to be like Pilate, unwilling to make a decision because you're afraid of what it'll cost you. I want you to be like Barabbas. I want you to receive the free gift of freedom that Jesus offers. Who in this story is free? Is Jesus free? He sure seems free, because he doesn't seem swayed by what's going on, even though he's in chains. Caiaphas and Pilate, they seem like they're free, but they're the most enslaved men in the whole story, aren't they? Caiaphas is so enslaved to his lifestyle that he's too afraid to see what is true. Pilate, he's doing this like a politician. What's the approval ratings? Let's see what the focus groups say before I make a decision. And Pilate, Pilate's telling Jesus, don't you know how much authority I have? I've got so much authority. I've got a lot of authority. And you're like, dude, you protest way too much. He keeps flexing about how much authority he has, but he has no authority at all. You know who has the authority in Pilate's life? The mob. He's going to wait around and see what the crowd says before he does anything, which means that he's not in control. He's enslaved to the focus groups. He's enslaved to his approval ratings. But there's one man in this story who walks away free, and his name is Barabbas. Barabbas was a man who tried things his own way. He pursued his own ends, his own pleasures with full force, and you know where it led him? To death row. And Barabbas knew he was guilty. He knew that he had messed up. He was a murderer. He was an insurrectionist. He was a robber. And now he's on death row, and he probably didn't want to be on death row, but at least in the back of his mind, he knew that he deserved it under the penalty of the law. And then one day, I want you to just imagine for a moment with me what that day in Barabbas' life must have been like. So I've been down in the dungeons in Israel where someone like Barabbas would have been held. It's deep down, stone walls. He wouldn't have been able to hear the conversations happening above ground, but he probably would have been able to hear the mob. So I want you to imagine, you're Barabbas, you're on death row, and all of a sudden, you're sitting there one day eating your, porridge or whatever they give you in prison, and then all of a sudden, Pilate's having this conversation up front. He's going, hey, do you guys want to set Jesus or Barabbas free? That's what the people heard. But you know what Barabbas heard? Do you want? Because he couldn't hear what Pilate was saying. All he then heard was the mob. We want Barabbas. He's, what? Oh, why are they calling my name out? Is it today? Oh no, today? I wasn't ready today. What do you want me to do with Jesus? Pilate says, crucify him. And Barabbas is going, okay, this is it. This is the moment. The mob is calling for my death. They're calling for my crucifixion. And then all of a sudden he begins to hear heels clicking down the stairs of a guard coming down to get him. His cell is unlocked. And the guard grabs him by the shoulder and pulls him up the stairs. And then they pull Barabbas out. He steps outside. He probably hadn't seen the sun in months. And they throw him out in front of the mob, and he's, the light in his face. And then when his pupils, get where they're supposed to be, and he looks out and he sees the crowd, it's just an angry mob. They're seething. They're furious. And he's thinking, this is it for me. My whole life has been building to this moment. I deserve this. I deserve to die, and today's the day. And then he looks over to his right, and he sees this man with a crown of thorns in his head and a purple robe. He's being mocked. He's being ridiculed. He's being insulted. And he's like, this man is in chains, and you would think he would be scared, but yet he's so calm. And he's staring straight ahead with this resolve. Who is this man, Barabbas thinks. And then he starts hearing the crowd going, we want Barabbas. Set Barabbas free. Kill Jesus. Crucify him. And Barabbas is like, what did he do? And then all of a sudden, the guard comes up to Barabbas, takes the key out, puts it in his chains. Clink. As Barabbas' chains fall. And the guard shoves Barabbas into the crowd. And Barabbas says, I'm free. I'm free. And then right as he starts scurrying off into his new life of freedom, he hears the screams of Jesus being whipped and flogged. And he goes, that man is dying in my place. That man took my place. Church, this is the gospel. 2 Corinthians 5:21, for God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Isaiah 53:5, he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities, and upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. Romans 5:8, for God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And so I ask you today, who are you going to be? What are you going to do? Are you going to be Caiaphas? Are you going to be Pilate, holding on to the things of the world because you're afraid of what following Jesus would cost you? Are you going to be like Barabbas? Are you just going to step out and receive what Jesus has done for you? That's all he does. See, Caiaphas and Pilate, they're fighting so hard to hold on to things that they can't hold on to. And Barabbas in this story, all he does is just receives the broken chains falling from his wrists. And so I ask you, are you going to keep striving? Are you going to keep fighting for things you can't keep? Chasing worldly pursuits, hoping that they'll give you life when the life of Jesus has been extended to you if you'll just receive it. This is the hope of the gospel. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and whoever believes in him will not perish, but will have everlasting life. Let me pray for you. God, I thank you that so many people in our world today, they think religion is about power. They think religion is about prestige and holding on. But God, Christianity is not about holding on to power. There's no hidden agenda with you, Jesus. Your agenda is to set prisoners free. And God, we're all prisoners. Prisoners to our sin. We're prisoners to our own desires. But yet, God, your word says that you came to set prisoners free. And so, God, I pray that we would lift up our chains to you so that you can remove them, so that we will surrender our lives so that we can have them back. God, I pray for anyone in this room who's still clinging to the things of Caiaphas and Pilate, thinking that that's where life will be found. God, I pray that you would show them what is true. God, for those of us who feel like Barabbas, God, I pray that you would offer us your freedom and your forgiveness. We thank you for the truth of your word, and it's in your name we pray. Amen. Church, would you stand? We're going to sing one more song of response. And I want to invite you today, if you're here and you're like, man, I want to receive what Jesus offers. I feel like Barabbas. I feel like I'm deserving of whatever destruction is coming my way. I feel like I've done this and that, and I don't know the way out. I don't know how to break these chains. And you're here today and you want to trust in Jesus to stand in your place, to die the death you deserve and give you the life that he earned. You can come today. I'm here. Dan is here. We would love to pray with you, pray for you, show you how you can know Jesus, how you can experience the freedom that he offers. If you're here and you just need prayer, we would love to pray for you. If you're here and you just want to come to this altar, you don't want to talk to any of us, but you just want to lay it all before the Lord, this altar is open. So as we sing, you respond however the Spirit leads.